My tiny kitchen was filled with the smell of stale coffee and burnt toast. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge of my coat tightly, feeling the cold seams press into my skin. Standing before me was Michael, the man I once loved so deeply it took my breath away. Now, he felt more distant than the storm raging outside. "What's your problem, Emily? You keep acting like this, and no one can take it anymore." His voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. His words weren't just criticism, they were an accusation. I couldn't respond immediately, not because I didn't have anything to say, but because my throat felt tight, as though someone was squeezing it. "My problem? My problem is you," I shouted, though my voice trembled, lacking the strength I had hoped for. "You don't even try anymore. We're supposed to be partners, Michael. But all you ever do is treat me like I'm some kind of burden." The words echoed in my mind the moment they escaped my lips. I knew I was right, but I also knew I was losing control. I hadn't wanted to say it, but the feelings poured out, unstoppable. Michael didn't reply right away. He just shook his head and let out a bitter, dismissive chuckle. That laugh made my chest tighten painfully. It wasn't the laugh of someone trying to understand, it was the laugh of someone who had given up. "Maybe you should take a good look at yourself before you start blaming me," he said, his voice flat and cold. His words were the final straw. I felt every syllable press down on my shoulders, crushing my heart. I had tried so hard, I knew that. But to him, everything I did was either not enough or outright wrong. I grabbed my coat from the chair, yanking it with a force that felt like it could sever every tie between us. Without looking back, I headed for the door. "Emily, the storm is terrible. Where are you going in weather like this?" I heard his voice calling after me, but I didn't care. I didn't need his warnings, his reminders. The only thing I needed was space to breathe. I needed to get out of this house, away from his cold eyes and words that made me feel small and worthless. As I stepped outside, the icy wind slapped my face, but I barely noticed. Snow fell heavily, clinging to my hair and shoulders, but I didn't feel cold. The only thing I felt was the storm within me, wild, chaotic, and uncontrollable. I rushed toward the car, yanked open the door, and slid into the driver's seat. I didn't know where I was going. Maybe I didn't care. What mattered was getting away, as far away as I could. The engine roared to life, blending with the howling wind outside. As I pressed the gas pedal, the car surged forward onto the snow-covered road. The headlights cut through the darkness ahead, but everything still seemed blurred. Much like my life, the path before me had no clear destination. I replayed every moment in that kitchen, the sound of Michael's voice, his cold laugh, and the look in his eyes that screamed I no longer mattered to him. Those thoughts cycled through my mind like a sorrowful melody, endlessly repeating. "No one can take you anymore." I gripped the steering wheel tightly, fighting back the tears that threatened to fall. I didn't want to cry. I had cried too many times, and each tear only made me feel weaker. But this time, I couldn't stop them. The tears streamed down my face, mixing with my ragged breaths in the icy cabin of the car. The storm outside didn't scare me. What terrified me was the emptiness inside, the feeling that I was no longer myself. I had lost the woman I used to love, strong, confident, and sure of what she wanted. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed to go. I couldn't stay, not tonight. Maybe not ever again. Outside, the wind howled in long, angry gusts, whipping through bare trees and turning the falling snow into swirling white whirlpools. The road before me was a black void, swallowed by darkness and heavy snowfall. The headlights of my SUV pierced the night, but only a few feet ahead before fading into the blizzard. My hands gripped the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath fogged the windshield with thin, fleeting clouds that blurred and disappeared instantly. I didn't know where I was headed. All I knew was that I had to leave that house. I had to leave Michael. The storm outside was nothing compared to the one raging inside me. Each gust of wind seemed to echo Michael's words, playing over and over in my mind like a worn-out record, monotonous yet crushing. No one can take you anymore. Look at yourself. You're a burden. Those words weren't just accusations. They were a complete denial of my worth, a rejection of everything I had poured into this marriage. They weren't quick cuts, they were slow, deliberate wounds that bled with every recollection. I blinked back at the heat in my eyes, though it wasn't from snow melting on my lashes. I wasn't crying out of pain, but from exhaustion from believing we could be happy, from loving, hoping, and trying to hold on to something that no longer existed. I pressed harder on the gas pedal. The car slid slightly on the icy road, making my heart jolt, but I didn't ease up. I couldn't turn back. I couldn't face Michael's eyes, the eyes that made me feel like a failure, weak, worthless. The storm in my heart kept roaring. It wasn't something I could escape just by leaving the house. It carried all the hurt, all the times I had fought for love and received only indifference in return. I glanced in the rearview mirror. The road behind me had vanished, buried under the snow as if it had never existed. The future before me was just as unclear, a faint beam of light in an endless void. But at least I knew I was moving forward, even if it was into the unknown. I couldn't turn back. I wouldn't. Sometimes, tears aren't a sign of weakness. They're proof of courage, the courage to let go, to refuse to stay in a place where you no longer belong. And tonight, amidst the snowstorm, I knew I had found that courage. The car jolted violently, like a wild animal thrown into chaos by the storm. I screamed, slamming my foot on the brakes, but it was useless. The tires screeched across the icy road, the sound stretching into a warning that came too late. The car spun out of control, skidding in circles before coming to an abrupt stop at the edge of the road. For a moment, my heart seemed to stop before it pounded furiously in my chest. My breath came in short, ragged gasps as my trembling hands clung to the steering wheel, my knuckles white from the strain. I sat frozen, every nerve in my body shaking as if every ounce of tension had finally erupted. When I finally calmed, I looked through the fogged window. In the distance, a faint light glimmered, dim but unmistakable. A gas station. Just a small, lonely station in the middle of this blizzard, but it felt like a beacon in the darkness. I exhaled shakily, started the car, and crept forward, inch by inch, as cautiously as walking on a tightrope. The gas station stood isolated, a tiny pinprick of light swallowed by a sea of white. Its flickering neon sign cast a weak, yellow glow, just enough to make it visible, but not enough to push back the overwhelming cold and solitude of the night. The wind howled mercilessly, the creaking sign swaying in its fury, mixing with the sound of snow lashing against the windows to create a haunting symphony. I stepped out of the car, wrapping myself in my thick coat, but the icy wind still cut through me, chilling me to the bone. Each step sank deep into the snow, the crunch of it breaking the eerie silence. The door to the gas station creaked open under my push, the faint ding of a bell nearly drowned by the wind's screams. Inside, a dim yellow light cast everything in shadows. The small room was cramped, shelves sparsely stocked with odds and ends. The air smelled of oil and old paper, a scent that made me wrinkle my nose. It was unnervingly quiet, the stillness broken only by the soft whistling of wind slipping through cracks in the walls. Behind the counter sat a young man with tousled hair, his face still holding traces of boyish innocence. His name tag read, Chris. "Hey," I said, forcing a smile even though I felt entirely out of place. Chris barely looked up, his gaze drifting from me back to his phone. He nodded slightly, his indifference making me feel like an intruder. I approached the counter, my breath forming thin clouds in the cold air. Water dripped from my hair onto my neck as the melting snow seeped in. The sound of my boots on the tiled floor echoed in the otherwise silent space, making me uneasy. "Do you have coffee here?" I asked, my voice hoarse from the cold. Chris shrugged, pointing toward a corner of the room where an old coffee pot Saturday some. "But it's cold." I poured myself a cup, watching the thick, dark liquid spill into the flimsy paper cup. It smelled burnt. Taking a sip, I winced at the bitterness, but I didn't care. At least it warmed my hands. As I turned, the door behind me burst open, and a blast of icy wind filled the room, carrying snowflakes that swirled in the air. I shivered, turning to see who had entered. That's when I saw him, Ethan Cole. He stepped inside like he'd just wrestled with the storm. His heavy coat was covered in snow, his dark hair slightly disheveled and damp. The gas station's dim light reflected off his sun-kissed skin. He brushed snow off his shoulders, his broad frame nearly filling the narrow doorway. His eyes met mine, a piercing, sharp gaze that seemed to see something in me I didn't even know was there. I froze for a moment, my heart pounding, not with fear but with a strange, unexplainable feeling, as though I'd just encountered someone the storm had purposefully brought into my path. "The storm's pretty bad out there," he said, his deep, warm voice breaking the silence, his breath misting in the cold air. I didn't respond immediately, only nodded, as if words had suddenly abandoned me. Then I realized, maybe this storm wasn't the only thing I had to face tonight. Inside the gas station, the air hung heavy with a sense of isolation. The howling wind outside seemed intent on swallowing the small, cramped space, seeping through every crack, carrying with it the echoes of the storm's relentless fury. The faint neon light cast ghostly shadows over the empty shelves, making them look like eerie silhouettes. The smell of burnt oil and dampness lingered in the air, mixing with the steady ticking of a clock on the wall, creating an atmosphere that was both mysterious and stifling. I stood motionless, a cup of lukewarm coffee in my hand, its faint warmth rising in wisps, but doing nothing to ease the chill inside me. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Perhaps a sliver of peace, or at least a touch of warmth, but this room offered neither. Suddenly, the doors swung open, letting in a blast of icy wind that carried snowflakes swirling in its wake. I turned around, and there he was, Ethan. He moved as if the storm outside didn't exist, each step deliberate yet unhurried. His thick coat was covered in snow, and his dark hair, damp with melted frost, dripped water onto the tiled floor, leaving faint stains. He shrugged his shoulders lightly, shaking off not just the snow but also the chaos from beyond the door. His eyes swept over the room before landing on me. It was just a fleeting glance, but for some reason I shivered, not from the cold, but from something unexplainable. There was a sharpness in his gaze, a quiet confidence that was impossible to ignore. It made me feel small, as if my entire being had been laid bare in that brief moment. "It's pretty bad out there," he said, his voice low and warm but tinged with weariness. It wasn't loud, yet it seemed to cut through the sound of the wind, grounding me in the present. I nodded, struggling to find words, but for some reason, nothing came. My mind was blank, and the space around us seemed filled only with the sound of water dripping from his coat and the wind howling outside. I realized I was staring at him longer than I should have, and the thought made me feel awkward. Chris, the young man behind the counter, finally tore his eyes away from his phone. He glanced at Ethan with a bored expression that seemed permanently etched on his face. "Need anything?" he asked, his tone indifferent, as if speaking to a ghost. Ethan gestured toward a shelf near the door, where a few stray items sat forgotten. "I'll figure it out myself." He walked past me, his tall frame seeming to fill the narrow space. There was a faint scent to him, a mix of earth, wind, and something untamed, that made me glance back over my shoulder. There was something about him, something beyond the way he moved or the sharpness of his eyes. It was his presence, a quiet intensity that made the room feel both smaller and less cold all at once. I stood frozen, the cup of coffee in my hand forgotten. Outside, the wind still howled, but I barely heard it anymore. My attention was entirely on this man who had walked into my life like a sudden gust of wind, carrying with him a mystery I couldn't yet unravel. Ethan moved between the shelves, the dim light from the flickering neon casting shadows that seemed to follow him. I tried to busy myself, scanning the disorganized snacks and soda cans, but it was impossible to ignore him. His presence seemed to fill the room, making it impossible to focus on anything else. Every time my eyes drifted toward him, my heart pounded a little harder, reminding me that this wasn't just another stranger on just another night. "Didn't think I'd run into anyone here tonight," his voice broke the heavy silence. Startled, I looked up. He was turned toward me, his gaze steady, holding a quiet challenge I couldn't quite ignore. I quickly composed myself, trying to sound casual. I didn't think so either, I replied, though my chest tightened with every word. My car slid off the road. What about you? Ethan shrugged, the gesture simple yet exuding confidence, as though the storm outside was no match for him. I was on my way to Boston. The storm forced me to stop. I nodded, the awkwardness creeping in again as my fingers tightened around the soda can I'd picked up. I'm Emily, by the way, I said, as if to bridge the gap between us. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an inexplicable need to say something, anything, to keep this conversation alive. He offered a faint smile, a brief but genuine one that softened the tension in the room. Ethan, he said, his voice steady and warm. Nice to meet you, even if the circumstances are unusual. I managed a small laugh, the unease in me easing slightly. He was right, this situation was anything but ordinary. Two strangers stranded in a tiny gas station during a raging snowstorm. And yet, instead of feeling uneasy, I found comfort in his presence, as if he were someone I could trust, or at least, someone I wanted to trust. His eyes lingered on mine for a moment longer, and I felt my heart race, not because of fear, but because of the way his gaze seemed to reach places within me I didn't even know existed. Chris emerged from the back room, carrying an old oil lamp. Its soft, flickering light cast a golden glow, illuminating the room with a faint warmth that stood in stark contrast to the icy cold outside. He placed it on the counter, the flame's shadows dancing on the walls and reflecting off the empty shelves. Power's not coming back anytime soon, Chris muttered, his voice flat, as if this were just another ordinary night. This area always loses electricity during storms. I stared at the small flame, its fragile light the only sign of life in the silent, desolate space. Chris's words sank in, a reminder that we were truly cut off from the world beyond the snowstorm. Looks like we're stuck here for a while, Ethan said, his deep voice pulling me from my thoughts. He glanced at me, his eyes catching the light of the flame, as if silently gauging my reaction. I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself. The truth was, I didn't know how to feel. Being stuck here with two strangers should have made me anxious, but it didn't. The storm still raged outside, threatening to tear everything apart, but inside, I felt lighter. Maybe it was because I didn't have to return just yet. I didn't have to face the cold emptiness of that house. I wasn't sure if this was good or bad, but part of me silently thanked the storm for keeping me here, at least for now. The faint light of the oil lamp, the eerie stillness of the room, and Ethan's steady gaze all created a strange mix of unease and comfort. Ethan leaned back against the counter, his arms crossed over his chest. So, what now? He asked, a faint smile tugging at his lips, as though he was ready to turn this into something more than just a waiting game. I shrugged, trying to hide the fact that, deep down, I wouldn't mind if time slowed down in this little gas station. The air felt frozen in place, punctuated only by the wind's relentless wail and the soft flicker of the oil lamp's flame. Chris seemed oblivious to everything, his eyes glued to his phone as his fingers scrolled mindlessly, as though the world outside didn't concern him in the slightest. Ethan, however, stood out, his posture relaxed, but his presence anything but passive. He held a soda can in one hand, but his eyes never left me, their intensity making me feel as if he could see past every wall I'd put up. So, Emily, he said, his voice breaking the silence with a quiet sharpness that demanded attention. Why were you driving in a storm like this? His question caught me off guard, like a stone thrown into still water, stirring emotions I wasn't ready to confront. I didn't want to answer, but his gaze, patient, warm, and somehow encouraging, seemed to invite honesty. I looked down at my hands, gripping the paper coffee cup tightly. It's just been a rough night, I said, keeping my tone light, as though there wasn't much to say. Ethan nodded slightly, his gaze never wavering. There was no curiosity or pity in his expression, only understanding. Sometimes, leaving it all behind is the only thing you can do, he said, his voice low and sincere, as if speaking from his own experience. His words made me look up, my eyes meeting his. In that moment, I didn't just see sympathy, I saw a deep sense of shared pain, as though he, too, knew what it was like to walk away from everything to search for something he couldn't yet name. I wanted to ask him more, to know what had driven him to leave it all behind. But as his gaze held mine, I felt a strange sense of security, as though I didn't need to ask, as though silence was enough. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside this small gas station, the air between us felt calmer. And for the first time that night, I didn't feel entirely alone. I turned back toward the window, the outside world swallowed by a swirling white void. The storm continued its merciless assault, shaking the glass panes as if determined to break through. Snow piled higher, erasing every trace of the road that had brought us here. Inside, the flickering flame of the oil lamp cast faint, moving shadows on the walls. There we were, 3 strangers brought together by chance, each carrying secrets that might never be spoken. Chris, detached and uninterested, remained absorbed in his phone, his presence more like a distant figure than a part of the moment. Ethan leaned against the counter, his quiet confidence suggesting he was no stranger to weathering storms of any kind. And me, a woman fleeing from her own life, finding herself in this strange, unexpected liminal space. Yet amid the tense stillness, I felt something I couldn't quite name, a sense of waiting, a feeling that something was about to shift. My life, once a blur of monotony and pain, suddenly seemed poised at a crossroads I hadn't seen coming. I watched the faint light of the lamp flicker, its tiny flame defiant against the storm. Somewhere deep inside me, a quiet stirring began, a whisper of emotions and desires I had buried for too long. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew this night wouldn't just be about waiting out the storm. It was the beginning of something bigger, something powerful, something the storm outside was merely a prelude to. The storm outside roared without mercy, gusts of wind slamming against the gas station walls as if trying to rip them apart. The glass windows rattled violently, mixing with the sound of snow pelting against the walls, creating a chaotic symphony of raw, unrelenting power. The faint light from the oil lamp Chris had just lit flickered across the room, casting weak, trembling shadows that failed to chase away the chill and gloom that filled the space. I sank into an old plastic chair near one of the shelves, the cold from the tiled floor seeping through the thin soles of my shoes. Though the lamp's glow offered a semblance of warmth, it couldn't ease the tension in the room. The howling wind outside sounded like the angry cries of some vengeful force, and at times, it felt as if the gas station might be ripped from the ground and carried away into the storm. Chris, as usual, remained glued to his phone, his fingers scrolling idly across the screen. His indifference was almost maddening, as though the storm raging outside had nothing to do with him. Ethan leaned against the counter, his eyes fixed on the frosted glass window now entirely obscured by snow. His tall frame exuded an uncanny calm, standing in stark contrast to the chaos outside. The flickering lamplight illuminated his sharp features and intense gaze, giving him an air of unshakable composure. "Well, it's clear we're not going anywhere," he said, breaking the heavy silence. His voice was low and steady, devoid of worry or doubt. Chris shrugged, without looking up. "Storms like this usually last all night. I'm used to it." I glanced at Ethan, unable to ignore the sharp contrast between him and Chris. While Chris seemed to shrink further into his detachment, Ethan radiated a quiet resilience that was both admirable and unsettling. There was a confidence in his demeanor that made me wonder if it was reassuring or something else entirely. "So, what now?" I asked softly, my voice cutting through the stillness. Ethan turned to look at me, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a broad smile, but it carried a strange sense of certainty, as though he had been waiting for this question all along. "We pass the time," he replied, his eyes glinting with a touch of mischief. "Anyone up for a game?" His suggestion caught me off guard. In a situation like this, the idea of playing a game seemed odd, almost absurd. Yet, it wasn't entirely unwelcome. At the very least, it might break the oppressive silence and ease the heaviness in the room. I studied Ethan, sensing that whatever he had in mind, it would be far from ordinary. Chris finally lifted his head from his phone, raising an eyebrow with a mix of mild curiosity and disdain. "What kind of game?" Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he strolled over to one of the shelves, his movements unhurried yet deliberate. He picked up a glass soda bottle and twirled it lightly in his hand, the lamplight reflecting off its surface, giving it an almost otherworldly shimmer. "How about a classic, Never Have I Ever," he said, his tone calm but tinged with playful challenge. Chris let out an audible sigh, leaning back against the counter with an expression of mild exasperation. "That's such a childish game." Ethan chuckled softly, his smile widening just enough to hint at provocation. "It's only childish if you're not willing to play honestly," he countered, his sharp gaze flicking to Chris before landing on me. "What about you, Emily? Want to join in?" I hesitated, a tangle of emotions swirling inside me. Games like this were never innocent. They had a way of drawing out secrets, exposing truths people often preferred to keep hidden. I wasn't sure I was ready to open up in front of these two strangers, especially not on a night like this. Yet, there was something in Ethan's voice, both inviting and insistent, that made refusal feel impossible. I studied him, searching for any hint of ulterior motives behind his half-smile. Maybe it was just a way to pass the time, or maybe he was seeking something more, a crack in the silence that bound us, a way to break through the barriers we had all put up. Whatever it was, I knew there was no backing out now. "Sure," I said, keeping my tone even, though I could feel my heart pounding a little faster. Ethan's smile deepened, a flicker of satisfaction in his eyes. "Good. Let's start." Chris sighed again, but finally set his phone aside, his reluctance evident as he dragged himself into the unfolding game. It struck me then that the storm outside wasn't just trapping us here physically, it was forcing us to confront things we might otherwise avoid, truths, loneliness, and perhaps even ourselves. Ethan placed the soda bottle on the floor, its glass surface catching the faint, flickering light of the oil lamp. He sat down cross-legged, gesturing for Chris and me to join him. The cold from the tiled floor seeped through the fabric of my jeans as I lowered myself to the ground, but I barely noticed. The tension in the air demanded all my attention. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on our faces, turning Ethan's features bold and commanding while making Chris's figure seem almost slouched and withdrawn. Chris let out a small snort, breaking the silence. "Fine, I'll go first," he said with a faint smirk, his tone edging on defiance. "Never have I ever skipped school without telling my parents." He smiled faintly, as if trying to keep the question light, a safe way to start. Ethan's lips curved in a faint smirk, his eyes narrowing slightly as though evaluating the remark. "Never skipped school," he said simply, his tone matter-of-fact. He then glanced at me, his gaze sharp, probing. I let out a quiet laugh, shaking my head. "Never skipped, but I've thought about it," I admitted, keeping my voice steady. Chris shrugged, taking a quick sip from his soda as if confirming his own truth. "I did. They never found out." His grin was brief, his eyes darting away as though he didn't want to elaborate further. Ethan chuckled, but it was a fleeting sound, his expression quickly turning serious. His focus shifted back to me, his tone lowering. "My turn," he said, his voice carrying an edge of intrigue. "Never have I ever thought about leaving everything behind to start over." The room seemed to freeze. Ethan's words, though casual on the surface, struck a nerve deep within me. It felt as though he had aimed them directly at me, unraveling a part of me I wasn't ready to confront. Chris averted his gaze, clearly uninterested in getting caught up in the tension that now blanketed the room. I stared down at the soda can in my hand, its cold surface biting against my fingers. I wanted to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I lifted the can to my lips and took a small sip, feeling the weight of Ethan's gaze on me the entire time. "Is that so?" he murmured, his voice soft yet filled with curiosity. His eyes remained locked on mine, searching for something beyond my guarded response. "Why?" I drew a deep breath, trying to maintain composure. "Sometimes life doesn't turn out the way you expect," I replied, keeping my tone flat, as though I could shield myself from the implications of his question. Ethan didn't press further, but his silence wasn't dismissive. It felt heavy, loaded with an understanding that went far deeper than my words. The storm outside howled louder, as if echoing the chaos swirling within me. For a moment, I felt completely exposed under Ethan's unrelenting gaze, like he could see the truths I was too afraid to admit, even to myself. I realized then that his question wasn't just for me. It was a fragment of something he carried, a piece of his own story. And for the first time, I wondered if Ethan was running from something too. As the game continued, the atmosphere in the room shifted. What began as light-hearted questions turned into something deeper, peeling back the layers we had all built to protect ourselves. Ethan, with his calm intensity, asked questions that struck chords in me I hadn't touched in years. Chris grew increasingly withdrawn, answering with shrugs and half-hearted remarks, clearly uncomfortable with the growing weight of the conversation. But I couldn't escape it. Each question Ethan posed felt like it was aimed straight at me, and every glance from him seemed to pierce the armor I'd spent so long building. The storm outside raged on, shaking the windows and blanketing the world in swirling white chaos. But the real storm was inside me, a tempest of suppressed desires, unhealed wounds, and unanswered questions. Ethan had somehow drawn it all to the surface. I glanced at him, my chest heavy with the weight of everything I was feeling. I couldn't understand why this stranger had such an effect on me. Maybe it was his unwavering gaze, neither judgmental nor pitying, but full of quiet understanding. Or maybe it was the way he listened, each word pulling at pieces of me I thought I'd buried forever. I didn't know if I could weather this storm. But worse, I wasn't sure I wanted to. For so long, I had lived in restraint, hiding behind walls of my own making. Yet now, with the storm raging within me, I felt those walls crumbling, and for the first time, I didn't want to stop it. I tightened my grip on the soda can, its coldness grounding me in the present. But this present wasn't like the one I'd known before. The small gas station, with its flickering lamplight, the relentless wind outside, and Ethan's piercing gaze, had become a battlefield, a place where I was forced to confront myself. I took a deep breath, feeling the storm within me grow stronger. And one thought consumed me: did I have the courage to let it tear everything apart, to let it change everything? The storm outside raged on, its howling winds and the furious pounding of snow against the windows echoing like a relentless drumbeat. Yet within the small gas station, a strange atmosphere lingered, a blend of warmth and tension. The dim glow of the oil lamp cast flickering shadows on the walls, its soft light dancing across Ethan's face, giving him the look of a character from an old novel. Ethan rose from his spot, his movements unhurried yet deliberate. He reached for an old radio on a dusty shelf, gently brushing off the grime as though handling a precious relic. The crackle of the radio knobs turning broke the quiet, followed by the soft hum of static. Then, as if by some small miracle, the room filled with the warm, soulful notes of a classic jazz tune. The music spilled into the space, wrapping around us like a velvet curtain, soothing the chaos outside. "We need something to ease the tension," Ethan said, his voice calm and steady as he turned to look at me, a faint, inviting smile on his lips. Chris, still leaning against the counter, shrugged nonchalantly. "It's nice music, but I don't think it'll help much," he muttered, his disinterest almost palpable. Ignoring Chris's cynicism, Ethan stepped toward me with a surprising grace. He extended a hand, a subtle yet confident gesture that caught me completely off guard. "Emily, care to dance?" I blinked at him, startled. "Dance?" I echoed, a soft laugh escaping me as I tried to comprehend the absurdity of his invitation. "Here? Are you serious?" Ethan arched a brow, his smile unwavering. "We're stuck in a gas station in the middle of a snowstorm. What could be stranger than that?" Chris, now slightly amused by the odd situation, chuckled. "You should go for it. Not everyone gets the chance to dance with a guy like him during a snowstorm." I glanced at Ethan, his outstretched hand steady, his eyes holding a glint of both encouragement and mischief. There was no pressure in his invitation, only a gentle nudge, as though he was asking me to step out of the shadows and into something I hadn't allowed myself to feel for a long time. My heart thudded a little faster, not from fear or embarrassment, but from something far more exhilarating, a rare, forgotten sense of excitement. Before my mind could overrule my body, I reached out, placing my hand in his. All right, I said, my voice soft but resolute. Ethan's hand was warm and firm as he helped me to my feet. He guided me to the small open space between the shelves, where the dim light of the oil lamp created a soft halo on the floor. This place, with its dusty shelves and flickering shadows, suddenly felt transformed, no longer just a shelter from the storm, but a stage for something unexpected. He placed one hand gently on my back, his touch both respectful and steady. "Relax," he said, his deep voice carrying a warmth that seemed to cut through the cold. I took a shaky breath, willing myself to loosen up. Slowly, I let the music guide me, following his lead as he moved effortlessly to the rhythm. My steps were hesitant at first, clumsy even, but Ethan's patience never wavered. His gaze remained on me, steady and calm, as though silently reassuring me that I was safe. "Let go," he murmured, his voice low and soothing, like the melody that surrounded us. Closing my eyes for a moment, I exhaled deeply, surrendering to the music, to his lead, and to the moment itself. My movements grew more fluid, my steps lighter, and soon, I wasn't just following him, I was moving with him. From behind the counter, Chris let out a loud laugh, his voice breaking the spell, but in a way that only added to the surreal charm of the moment. "I can't believe you're actually doing it. Kudos to you, Ethan. You've officially made this gas station more exciting than it's ever been." Ethan didn't respond to Chris's teasing. His smile remained, but his focus was entirely on me. The world outside, the storm, the cold, and even Chris's amused commentary, faded into the background. I met his gaze and found myself smiling, almost in disbelief at what we were doing. "Do you do this often?" I asked, my tone light but curious. He tilted his head slightly, his grin deepening. "Do what?" "Dance in gas stations during snowstorms," I replied, a hint of playfulness creeping into my voice. His chuckle was soft, almost intimate. "Only when I have the right partner." My heart skipped a beat at his words. There was a weight to them, a sincerity that caught me off guard. For a fleeting moment, the pain and doubt I had carried into this place seemed to lift, replaced by something lighter, something I hadn't felt in a long time. Under the glow of the oil lamp and the sway of the music, the gas station became a world apart. It wasn't just a refuge anymore. It was a place where I could let go, even if only for a little while, and feel something other than the heaviness that had been suffocating me. We moved together, our steps falling into sync with the soft jazz that played on the old radio. The storm outside howled its fury, but in here, there was peace, a fragile, fleeting peace that felt almost sacred. Ethan's voice broke through the music, soft and contemplative. "How does it feel?" I glanced up at him, a small, genuine smile tugging at my lips. "I don't know," I admitted honestly. "But I think this is what I needed." He nodded, his expression thoughtful, as though he'd known that all along. For a moment, we danced in silence, our movements speaking more than words ever could. Time seemed to stand still, and all that existed was the music, the faint light, and the warmth of his hand guiding me. Chris clapped his hands from behind the counter, his laughter cutting through the quiet intimacy of the moment. "Bravo, you too. Never thought I'd see a gas station become a ballroom, but here we are." I laughed, my earlier awkwardness completely gone, replaced by a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Ethan chuckled too, the deep rumble of his voice adding to the warmth that filled the space. But just as quickly as the moment had begun, it was interrupted. The oil lamp flickered once, then again, before its flame sputtered out completely, plunging the room into total darkness. "What the hell?" Chris's voice cut through the pitch black, a nervous edge creeping into his tone. The sudden absence of light was jarring, amplifying the sounds of the storm outside. The wind seemed louder, more menacing, and the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the darkness itself had weight. I froze, my breath quickening. The silence between us was almost suffocating, broken only by the relentless pounding of snow against the windows. Ethan's hand gently found my shoulder, his touch steadying me. "It's all right," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It's just the lamp." We'll get it lit again." His words were reassuring, but there was something in his tone, a faint edge, a trace of something unspoken, that made me wonder if he felt the same unease creeping through me. In the darkness, every sound felt magnified, the soft rustle of Chris fumbling for something behind the counter, the distant creak of the building under the weight of the storm, and the faint rhythm of Ethan's breath beside me. "Chris," Ethan called, his voice cutting cleanly through the void. "Do you have another lamp?" "Maybe in the back," Chris replied, his voice shaky. "I'll go," Ethan said, his hand brushing mine briefly before he stepped away. I stood still, enveloped by the darkness, my senses heightened. The storm outside continued its merciless assault, but it was something else, something unseen and unspoken, that prickled at the edges of my awareness. Something was coming. And whatever it was, I wasn't sure if I was ready to face it. Inside the small gas station, the atmosphere remained heavy and cold. The relentless symphony of wind and snow striking against the windows continued without pause, a chilling reminder of the storm's fury. The dim beam of light from Chris's flashlight illuminated the room, casting strange and restless shadows on the walls. Chris sat slouched behind the counter, the flashlight angled on the floor, its weak glow highlighting his tired, bored expression. His eyes were heavy, his voice low as he muttered something I couldn't entirely catch, but the sentiment was clear: I hate nights like this. He turned his gaze toward Ethan and me, his movements sluggish, yet there was a subtle restlessness to him, a discomfort he couldn't quite mask. "So, are we just going to sit here all night?" Chris asked, his voice drawn out as if he didn't expect a serious answer. Ethan, standing near me, chuckled softly, a low, warm sound that carried a hint of amusement. He pulled a plastic chair closer and sat beside me, his posture relaxed, but his sharp eyes never leaving mine. "Not necessarily sitting in silence," he replied, his voice tinged with both humor and something deeper. "There's still time to do something different." I raised an eyebrow, curiosity and caution both sparking within me. "What do you mean?" I asked, unable to fully suppress the skepticism in my voice. Ethan leaned back slightly, crossing his arms over his chest as if weighing his words. "I mean, have you ever thought that sometimes being stuck like this isn't bad luck, it's an opportunity?" His tone was calm, deliberate, every word carrying a quiet conviction. An opportunity to pause, reflect, and do something you've never dared to do. His words struck a nerve, cutting straight through the layers of fear and doubt I'd been carrying. This storm, this escape from the cold, fractured house I'd left behind, it all seemed clearer now, reframed by his perspective. Yet, it also left me feeling exposed, as though he could see the thoughts I had been trying to bury. I lowered my gaze, my hands clasped tightly together in my lap. "I'm not sure," I admitted, my voice so soft it barely rose above the howl of the wind. "I'm not good at change." Ethan leaned forward slightly, his eyes catching the faint beam of light from Chris's flashlight. His expression softened, his gaze steady yet kind, carrying a rare kind of sincerity. "You've already changed, Emily," he said, his voice calm but unyielding. "The fact that you're here, in the middle of this storm, stepping away from what's familiar, that's already a big step." His words made me pause. I didn't know how to respond because, deep down, I knew he was right. Leaving that house, even in anger, had been a step I'd never dared to take before. But fear still gripped me, holding me back from fully embracing the possibility of change. I looked up, meeting Ethan's unwavering gaze. He didn't look away, as though waiting for something, a response, an action, or perhaps just a glimmer of acknowledgement that I understood what he was trying to tell me. "So," I began, my voice slightly hoarse, but firmer now, "what do you think I should do next?" Ethan's smile wasn't exactly an answer, it felt more like a silent encouragement. "Keep moving forward," he said simply, his words heavy with meaning. "Even if you're unsure of the path ahead." For a moment, the storm outside seemed to quiet, replaced by a strange stillness that settled over the room. For the first time, the silence didn't feel oppressive. Instead, it felt like an invitation, a chance to confront my own storm, the one raging within me, and the truths I had been avoiding for so long. Chris snorted, breaking the contemplative pause. All right, are you two done philosophizing? Anyone want something to drink? Ethan laughed lightly, the sound warm and soothing, as if it were his way of softening the emotional weight of the moment. I found myself smiling too, though my smile carried something new, a faint but growing sense of readiness. I didn't know where I would go next, but I felt, for the first time, that I could take the next step. Ethan's words lingered in my mind, unlocking memories I had tried to lock away. Michael's face surfaced in my thoughts, the man I had once thought was my everything. I remembered the early days when we had just met, the way he made me laugh with a carefree joy I hadn't known before. He used to notice every little thing about me, how I preferred my coffee unsweetened, the way I frowned at bad books, or the way I giggled when it rained. Those memories were vivid, filled with a warmth that I now realized had long since faded. But as time passed, the sweetness of those days gave way to something colder. His kind words were replaced by sharp critiques. "You can't do anything right," he had once said, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Do you even think you're good enough?" I could still see his face, etched with indifference, the love I thought was there now replaced by apathy. His gaze used to make me feel cherished, now, it only left me feeling small and broken, as though every problem in our relationship was my fault. I had spent countless nights sitting alone in the dark, wondering if things could have been different if only I had tried harder, if only I could change. I had rewritten myself over and over, altering how I dressed, how I spoke, even how I smiled, in a futile attempt to become the woman I thought he wanted. But the harder I tried, the further apart we grew. Sitting there under the dim light of Chris's flashlight, I realized something I had been too afraid to admit before. The problem wasn't that I hadn't tried hard enough. The problem was that I had been trying for the wrong reasons. I had lost myself in my desperate bid to save a love that no longer existed. I had clung to the hope that if I changed enough, things would go back to the way they were. But love isn't something that can be revived by one person's effort alone. Ethan remained by my side, his presence grounding me. Though he said nothing, his quiet attention spoke volumes. He was there, unintrusive yet steady, holding space for me in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Chris sighed heavily, cutting through the silence. "I'm going to check the back. Need to see if the snow's blocking the exit. Don't want to be stuck here all night," he muttered before grabbing his flashlight and disappearing into the back room. The door clicked shut, leaving Ethan and me alone in the dim, shadowy space. The faint beam from Chris's abandoned flashlight cast long, shifting shapes on the walls, as the storm's howl continued its relentless song outside. "Emily," Ethan's voice broke the quiet, low and deliberate, drawing my attention back to him. I turned to face him, his steady gaze catching mine. There was something piercing about his eyes, as though he could see past every layer I had built around myself, leaving me with nowhere to hide. "Have you ever felt like you were living a life that wasn't yours?" he asked, each word carefully measured, carrying a gentle yet undeniable weight. My heartbeat quickened, his question striking a chord deep within me. I knew it wasn't random, it was a question meant for me, one that resonated with the truth I had long ignored. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady, though I knew exactly what he was asking. Ethan leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "I mean the kind of life where you're so caught up in what others expect of you, friends, family, society, that you forget who you really are." His words hit me like a wave, crashing against the walls I had built to keep myself safe. My chest tightened, each syllable pulling at emotions I had worked so hard to bury. I drew in a deep breath, searching for a response, but all I could manage was a quiet confession. "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I forgot who I was a long time ago." Ethan nodded, his expression understanding. It was as though he had expected my answer all along. "Then maybe," he said, his tone firm yet encouraging, "it's time you found her again." His words hung in the air, a soft yet resounding call to action. They left no room for avoidance, forcing me to confront what I had spent so long running from. I turned to him fully, his unwavering gaze meeting mine. There was no judgment in his eyes, only quiet strength and a kind of patience I hadn't realized I needed. Outside, the storm continued to rage, its furious winds battering the fragile walls of the gas station. But inside, another storm had begun to take shape, one I could no longer ignore. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, I could weather it. The storm outside had finally quieted. The howling winds that had raged through the night were now nothing more than faint whispers. Pale beams of dawn began to filter through the thick snow blanketing the windows, casting soft, ghostly streaks of light across the cold floor. Inside the gas station, the air felt still, heavy with the residue of a night filled with raw emotions and revelations. I startled awake, momentarily disoriented to find myself slumped in a plastic chair. Chris stood in front of me, holding a steaming cup of coffee. The faint curls of vapor rising from the paper cup seemed almost miraculous. He handed it to me, a familiar smirk playing on his face. "Reheated it over the oil lamp," he said, his tone laced with playful sarcasm. "Not gourmet, but it's better than nothing." I smiled, my fingers curling around the warm cup, grateful for its comforting heat. "Thanks, Chris," I murmured, my voice hoarse but sincere. I took a sip, wincing at the bitter, slightly burnt taste. It wasn't pleasant, but it woke me up. Across from me, Ethan sat in silence as usual, his sharp yet gentle eyes observing me with an intensity that felt like he was uncovering thoughts I hadn't yet admitted to myself. Chris broke the silence. "Hey," he said, gesturing toward the frosted windows. "The snow stopped, but we're gonna have to dig our way out if we want to leave." I turned to look at the windows, where the morning light illuminated a landscape of snow piled high. Though the storm had passed, the road ahead was still buried beneath the white drifts, indistinguishable from the rest of the world. Ethan nodded, a flicker of determination crossing his face. He stood, zipping up his thick jacket in preparation for the cold. "Let's do it together," he said firmly. "It won't take long if we all pitch in." Chris snorted, shoving his hands into his coat pockets. "Sure, let's hope I don't freeze solid out there," he muttered, though there was no real resistance in his voice. I stood, clutching the coffee cup tightly, letting its warmth spread through my fingers. The storm had passed, but I knew that the changes within me were only beginning. Clearing the snow felt symbolic, like a physical act of clearing away the burdens that had weighed me down for so many years. Ethan glanced back at me before stepping outside, his eyes carrying a silent reassurance, "We'll get through this." I took a deep breath, following him. Not just into the snow, but into the uncharted path I knew I had to walk. The three of us worked together in the frigid morning air, the silence broken only by the rhythmic scrape of shovels and the soft crunch of snow underfoot. Chris grumbled under his breath as he shoveled heavy chunks of snow out of the way, his face pinched with irritation from the cold. Ethan, undeterred by the lack of tools, used his hands to push aside mounds of snow, his breath visible in the icy air. I focused on scraping the frost off the car windows with a small plastic scraper I'd found inside the gas station. Every motion, every shove of the snow, felt like a step forward, a slow, deliberate dismantling of the barriers that had kept us trapped. Though we spoke little, the work itself seemed to bond us, our shared efforts cutting through the lingering isolation of the night before. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the thick gray clouds, I paused and looked up. The golden light glinted off the snow-covered landscape, transforming it into a shimmering sea of diamonds. The world, so recently battered by the storm's fury, now appeared pristine, peaceful, a place reborn. I stood there, letting the soft sunlight touch my face, its faint warmth a stark contrast to the biting cold. A strange sense of calm rose within me, a kind of peace I hadn't realized I'd been yearning for. Ethan stopped beside me, his hands red from the cold but relaxed, his gaze also fixed on the golden horizon. "It's beautiful," he said softly, his voice carrying more than admiration for the view. I nodded, a small, genuine smile forming on my lips. "It is," I agreed, my voice quiet but full of meaning. "It feels like a fresh start." Ethan turned to me, his smile gentle and his eyes shining in the morning light. I couldn't tell what he was thinking, but in that moment, I felt as though we shared an unspoken understanding that sometimes, the most violent storms leave behind the most beautiful skies. Chris's voice broke through the quiet, his tone laced with exaggerated frustration. All right, we're nearly done. Now, who's gonna make me a fresh cup of coffee? We all laughed, the sound ringing out against the snow-covered expanse. It was a laugh born of relief, a shared acknowledgement that the storm, both outside and within, had finally passed. Back inside the gas station, the room felt warmer, the weak glow of the oil lamp no longer fighting against the oppressive cold. The air was lighter, though the thoughts swirling within me were still heavy with reflection. Chris sat back behind the counter, fiddling with his phone. He frowned briefly before letting out a relieved sigh. Weak signal, but I think I can call for help, he said, looking up at Ethan and me. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere. The night had forced me to confront emotions I hadn't dared to name, like a strange dream that left its mark long after waking. The storm may have passed, but I knew with certainty that I couldn't go back to the way things were. Ethan sat across from me, holding a fresh cup of coffee Chris had brewed. He didn't speak, but his presence was steady, his gaze calm and understanding, as though he knew I was standing on the precipice of a choice I could no longer avoid. Emily, he said finally, his voice gentle but weighted with purpose. What will you do when you leave here? His question, though simple, struck me with unexpected force. I stilled, the warm cup of coffee in my hands grounding me as my thoughts churned. I stared at my hands for a moment, feeling the steady thrum of my heartbeat. His words had unearthed something I hadn't yet dared to face. I don't know for sure, I admitted, my voice soft but steady. But I know I can't keep waiting, or being afraid. Ethan nodded, his expression warm yet serious. His gaze held a quiet respect I hadn't seen in anyone before. Good, he said, his tone devoid of judgment, carrying only support. You deserve better, Emily. His words were like a light cutting through the fog in my mind. They weren't just encouragement, they were a reminder that I didn't have to keep living by the expectations others had placed on me. I looked back at him, a small but genuine smile breaking across my face. For the first time in what felt like years, I felt a flicker of determination stirring within me. Chris, still focused on his phone, seemed oblivious to the shift in the room's energy. I'll call for help, he said matter-of-factly. With luck, we'll be out of here by noon. I nodded, feeling as though a new chapter had just begun. The storm outside, and the one within me, had passed. And this time, I was ready to move forward, without fear, without waiting, and without looking back. The roads were finally cleared, revealing a winding path leading back to the world outside. The thick snow had been shoveled away, but the icy chill still lingered in the air. Above us, the sky was brighter, carrying the promise of a new day. Chris, with his usual nonchalance, shrugged as he stepped out of the gas station. Here's hoping we don't run into another storm, he said, his farewell short and simple, as though he was eager to leave the past night behind. I smiled softly and nodded in response. Thank you for your help, I said, knowing full well he wouldn't dwell on it. Near his car, Ethan stood, his thick coat dusted with stray snowflakes. He looked at me with those sharp yet gentle eyes, as if he had something to say but wasn't in a rush to say it. Emily, he began, his voice steady and warm, filled with sincerity. If you ever need someone to talk to. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper, carefully placing it in my hand. I glanced down and saw a phone number scribbled neatly, along with a short yet powerful message. Don't let the next storm catch you. I looked back at him, a small, involuntary smile spreading across my face. Warmth filled my chest, not from the cold air but from the unspoken connection that had formed between us. Thank you, Ethan, I said softly but earnestly. For everything. He smiled in return, a fleeting yet impactful gesture that I knew I wouldn't forget. Take care of yourself, Emily, he said before stepping into his car. I stood there for a moment, watching as his car slowly disappeared down the snowy road. His figure faded into the distance, but the echoes of his words and his presence lingered, imprinted in my mind. I glanced down at the piece of paper in my hand. The words weren't just a message, they were a reminder. I didn't have to wait anymore, nor did I have to run. I could choose my own path. Taking a deep breath, I let the cold, crisp air fill my lungs. The storm had passed, not just the one outside, but the one within me. And now, I was ready to step into a new chapter, no longer defined by fear or waiting. With the note still in my hand, I turned, climbed into my car, and started the engine. As I drove down the winding road, the sunlight glinting off the snow felt like a quiet celebration of resilience and renewal. The drive home was peaceful, the white landscape passing by like a moving painting outside my window. The clear blue sky, so serene after the chaos of the storm, held a strange beauty that mirrored the calm I now felt inside. My mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, replaying the moments of the previous night like a film on slow rewind. I thought about Ethan's eyes, the dance under the soft glow of the oil lamp, and his words, especially the way he affirmed that I deserved more. Those simple words had sparked something within me, igniting a flame that burned away the fog of doubt I had carried for so long. When I pulled into my driveway, I paused, sitting still in the driver's seat. Through the windshield, I saw the front door of the house that had once been everything to me. But now, it looked like another storm, waiting to draw me back in. A flicker of nervousness ran through me, but this time, it wasn't fear. I had weathered the storm outside, and, more importantly, I had survived the one within. Stepping out of the car, I inhaled deeply, letting the icy morning air sting my cheeks. In my hand, Ethan's note rested like a talisman. The words on it echoed in my mind. "Don't let the next storm catch you." With determined steps, I walked toward the front door. My movements were purposeful, each step a quiet declaration that I was no longer the person who would shrink back or wait for change. I knew I had turned the page on an old chapter and was stepping into a new one where I would live for myself, no longer bound by fear or indecision. If my story resonated with you, please hit like and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their inner strength. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories. Together, let's face life's storms and find the light at the end of the road.